All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with some housekeeping items. Hi, I am Maggie Bittner, and I'm the host. I'm the events manager for MDR. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into the education market and have a series of sessions and presenters to walk through the ins and outs of how to best tap into this community. Before we get started, a few quick things. We have a big group, so we're going to keep everybody muted for the duration. We encourage you to use the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye on those and answer as many as we can throughout the afternoon. If we can't get them to them all, somebody will follow up with you directly after today's event. We are going to be recording this webinar and we'll be able to share it with you after the fact. We'll be sending out a link later this week. And I think that's about it. If there's anything you need, please raise your hand or use that Q&A box and we will get to you. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Spearing, who is our MC this afternoon. He is the new customer acquisition sales leader, working with customers and teams to achieve their sales and marketing goals under these challenging circumstances. Chris has a unique perspective as a customer of marketing services throughout 20 years of sales and marketing leadership roles in global manufacturing, telecommunications, and software organizations. His primary goal is to support your organization's growth. Let me turn things over to Chris.
Thanks, Maggie. Welcome again. Today, as you can see, we have a full agenda designed to paint a picture of the education market and share what we know about how to reach and engage educators. Some of you may be newer to the channel, while others have played in this market for many years. We will cover some traditional wisdom as well as some trends that we've seen over the past year and more recently. I am Chris Spearing and I will be your MC for the afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about MDR. For over 50 years, MDR, has been the de facto source for educator behavior and data. We help partners like you build your brands, make an impact, and support your goals. We are a division of Dun & Bradstreet with expertise in education data and marketing intelligence. Through our market data, campaign activation, and agency services, we can build you a marketing engine or be your marketing engine by integrating rich data with unique digital, creative, and branding capabilities. As you can see, again, looking at the agenda, we'd like to share some of that knowledge with you. We have a lineup of 4 different sessions delivered by our leaders. You will walk away with a solid understanding of the size and structure of the K-12 education community, where educators look for information, how to increase engagement and optimize content through digital marketing, and buying patterns and behaviors. I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter, Ann Goto, and the introduction could not be long enough. Ann Goto is our data analytics and quality leader at MDR. Ann has been with MDR for almost 30 years in a variety of roles, including leading the development of MDR high-quality comprehensive education database, quality advocacy, data analytics, and her current role where she helps customers make effective use of their data. The term definitely applies that Ann has forgotten more about this data than we will all ever know. So without further ado, Ann.
Thanks very much, Chris. And thank you all for attending today. Top level information about the education market. The goal is to have you walk away with key indicators and benchmarks that influence education. We're going to cover 5 key areas today. Some interesting facts about the power of the school community, some top-level firmographics on the size of the education market. I'll discuss some key sources of education funding, including the latest CARES Act federal grant to help has been done to help offset the COVID pandemic costs. We'll then move into school spending, making sure that you think about spending beyond textbooks and school supplies. And finally, we'll share some information from MDR's most recent school teacher survey about the purchase of school supplies. So let's get started. Next slide. So according to NCES, for the 2017-18 school year, expenditures for the PK and higher ed market, including public and private education, was estimated at $1.4 trillion. That's trillion with a T. With PK-12 market making up about $789 billion of that, post-secondary degree granting higher education institutions about 680,000 or billion of that. This makes up a whopping 7.2% of the national gross domestic product. So a huge amount of information, or a huge amount of dollars go into education. So where does the funding come from? Primarily taxpayer investment. About 8% comes from federal sources, namely in terms of federal grants. About 40%, 47% state, and 45% local funding. So even when we hear about school budget cuts and education not having enough money, you should always remember that education market has a strong backbone of funding. Interestingly, did you know that 1 in 4 Americans goes to school every day? And the average expenditure for that student is $11,453. Let's talk a little bit more about school community. Schools are the heart of almost every community. Beyond learning, they also do things like provide food security, safety, social and emotional support, and even daily structure. I mentioned in the last slide that 1 in 4 Americans attend school daily, but in fact, nearly half the US population belongs to the pre-K-12 community in schools. When you include parents and caregivers and teachers, as well as students, you end up with a much higher percentage. Nearly half the population belongs to the pre-K community, pre-K through 12 community. The power of school communities is a force for good and bright future. We've seen this with the return of school this fall in the unprecedented time of COVID-19. Communities have had to band together to figure out ways to make education work, finding ways to feed students, even when they're not in a school building where they usually receive supplemental meals, establishing online and remote learning and the tools to make this happen. Needs go beyond just educators, and the strength and power of the entire school community helps develop and implement safe options that meet each community's local needs. Next slide. So let's start breaking down the education universe. Reflecting on MDR's expansive education data cloud, there are over 7.3 million educator personnel in the US. This includes teachers and faculty, of course, but also includes administrators and leadership and support personnel like guidance, school nurses, technology, coordinators, and such. These educators work in almost 14,000 or 14,000 districts, almost 115,000 pre-K through 12 schools, over 7,000 higher ed institutions, over 17,000 public libraries, and over 100,000 licensed daycare centers. Beyond institutions and contacts themselves, MDR compiles over 300 building level firmographic selections and over 4,000 job roles to allow you to target the institutions and contacts that are most valuable to you. Next slide. As of the 2019-20 school year, there were almost 54 million pre-K through 12 students in the US. About 50 million of these are public school students. This graph displays the distribution of public school students across the districts that they go to. Although districts come in all different sizes, districts with enrollments of greater than 10,000 students actually have a low count in number of just about 1,200 institutions. But the students that attend these districts include 56% of the students across the US. At the other end of the spectrum, small districts with enrollments of less than 2,500 serve only about 8 million students, about 16% of the school population. Next slide. School grade level is another way to segment the K-12 market. When considering markets to target, grade level is one of the most common indicators based on what you're marketing. Elementary schools make up 58% of the public schools. They tend to be smaller and service a smaller, close-knit group of students, thus are greater in number. Middle schools and junior highs make up about 15%, senior highs about 20%, and K-12 schools about 6%. Metropolitan areas such as urban, suburban, town, and rural, in this case, the chart here, we're looking at district distribution, which has a similar pattern as district enrollment size. As urban districts are much smaller in count, they're well above average in enrollment size. So although the overall number of districts in urban areas is only a little over 1,200, they again have a high volume of students. Rural areas tend to have smaller district enrollments, but they need more of these districts to provide reachable education based on number of students per square mile. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at some enrollment by geography. State enrollments vary significantly. California having the largest enrollment with almost 6 million students, balanced out by the other end of the spectrum with Vermont having the smallest enrollment with only 95,000 students. This map shows distribution across region. And you can certainly segment by region. More importantly, you could probably segment by state. When looking at this map, we've called out the 10 largest states. It's interesting that these 10 states actually make up over 50% of the enrollment nationally. So when considering who to target in the education market, key indicators such as enrollment distribution, school types, and states are great ways to help you strategically pinpoint the scope of your outreach in the education market. Next slide. We've been looking at enrollment and district and school distributions across several firmographic indicators. Let's change our focus to federal funding. As noted in an earlier slide, 8% of all education funding comes from federal sources. According to the Department of Education, total appropriation in 2019 was $81 billion, with about $40 billion going to K-12 and about $34 billion going to higher education. This is distributed to education institutions through many federal grants. This slide is showing just a few examples of these, such as over $1 million is awarded to special ed funding through the IDEA grants annually. About 39,000 schools receive allocations for Title II funding grant for improving teacher quality. This grant provides over $100,000 in funding. And Title I, serving disadvantaged students, is the largest education federal grant. It provides over $2.5 million across all 50 states. Following federal grant dollars is a great way to target districts as they receive funds for spending in key areas. MDR can help you with that. If you're interested, please visit our website and register for a free trial of our Market View product or explore our connected cloud platform. Next slide. Now I'd like to take a look at expenditure data by different demographics and firmographics. Here we have all instructional materials, commonly known as AIM, which includes all supplies and materials used for instruction purposes. Spend for AIM is over $13 billion annually. MDR takes this information and breaks it out by spending per pupil, because we find that to normalize to this level helps us look at spending regardless of the number of students being served. As an example, the national spending per student, or the spending AIM spending per student nationally is $279. This map shows the dark blue states where AIM is at the highest spending per pupil. These include many of the largest states like California, New York, and Texas, but they also include states that have predominantly smaller districts such as Montana, Maine, and Wyoming, who have to spend possibly more per student because they have less students and they need to cover basic costs. Next slide. This graph illustrates that concept well, showing that the smallest districts have a higher propensity of per pupil spend than the largest districts. So you can see in the smallest districts, almost 60% of those districts spend $300 or more per pupil, where in the largest districts, they're only 30% of those districts are at the highest AIM spend per pupil. Next slide, thanks. We can also look at current expenditure, which reflects the total operating cost for a district. This would include AIM, as well as things like support services, food services, technology, hardware, etc. Where the AIM average spend per student is $279, the average current expenditure per student is $11,453, taking into consideration the salary of teachers, the actual facilities, as well as AIM and other materials. This graph illustrates that about 50% of all public schools spend over $10,200 per student. Next slide. Finally, when we're talking about expenditures and funding, I want to share a bit about the latest available federal grant, the CARES Act funding. The CARES Act funding, which is the Corona Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, was passed in March of this year for $30 billion. $13.2 billion went to K-12 education, $14 billion to higher ed, and an additional $3 billion went to the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which can be used for significantly impacted school districts or higher education institutions. Funds started to flow to districts this summer, but not all spending is done. In fact, the funds that were allocated from CARES have the ability to be used and spent right through September 2022. So there's a large window of time which these dollars can be spent. Funding distributions to states was based on the formula, a similar formula that's used for Title I dollars. Next slide. There are a variety of products and services that are eligible to be covered by the CARES funds. States have a flexibility in how to use these stabilization funds. Possible areas of spending include, but aren't limited to, PPE, including cleaning and disinfecting supplies, as well as masks, shields, and such, plexiglass and such. Technology, such as purchasing one-to-one devices and internet service for students without Wi-Fi access. Training and professional development to help teachers learn how to teach remotely more effectively. addressing the unique needs of low-income students and special population students, meal programs, filling gaps where students are receive food from schools as a primary source for breakfasts and lunches. Of course, providing mental health services to help manage through this challenging time, and any activity that's authorized by ESA. If you're interested in CARES Act funding allocations by district, these are available through MDR's MarketView platform. MarketView helps boost your insight into the education market with comprehensive institution, contact, and funding opportunities. We have district level allocations for all but 3 states for the CARES funding. 3 states we don't have because they're still in preliminary allocations are Delaware, Hawaii, and Nevada. But all others, we do have allocations per district. If you're interested in a trial of MarketView through our Connected Cloud platform, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to get that set up for you. Beyond CARE dollars, you're likely aware that the next wave of COVID-related stimulus funding, which they're calling HEROES this time, is still under consideration and has been for the last few months. Its initial proposal was for over $200 billion to education this time. Congress has been hammering this out over a period of time, and honestly, the proposed dollar amounts have gone above 200,000 or 200 billion, below 200 billion, and anywhere in between. Congress hasn't been able to seem to settle on this yet, but it's likely that something will be passed after the election, creating another round of opportunity. Next slide. My final slide shares what teachers need now. To help understand the impact of COVID-19 has had on what teachers need, in August of this year, MDR partnered with our award-winning media brand, We Are Teachers, and surveyed nearly 3,000 pre-K through 12 educators nationally. And we compiled everything that we learned into about school supply lists into a report called an inside look at school supply lists for 2021, helping districts and educators adapt. I want to share a couple of top takeaways from this survey with you on what teachers have told us about tools and resources they need. Desire with facing the need for remote learning and being able to support remote learning. It's important that they have the right equipment, both for teachers and students. The next level was professional training, specifically on remote teaching and engagement, also got a strong response of 61%. Communications about safety concerns and mental health support also made the top 5. On the right side of the slide, these are responses when asked what tools and resources your district will be providing you for this year. Digital devices for teachers and for students and access to online learning platforms and resources got the most focus as districts are determining how to support instruction this year, whether school is in school facilities, remotely, or some kind of hybrid approach. Cleaning supplies and PPE also received a strong interest in need as important need for getting back to school. If you're interested in seeing this full report, if you'd like a copy, please contact MDR. The report includes responses to many more survey questions from our 3,000 teachers, as well as some guidance on how you can help districts and educators adapt to this new school year. And that's about all I have to cover today. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Anne. there's a question about expenditure and
Yep.
any changes to expenditure year over year. Do we typically see major shifts in spending year over year? Does it seem to be consistent, dependent on other factors?
Yep. So that's a great question. So MDR does compile expenditure data. We work with each Department of Education to get information at the district level for both the AIM expenditure and the current expenditure. Overall, expenditure data, or the spend continues to go up year over year. When you look nationally, it goes up usually 1 to 2%. There are always a handful of states that seem to spike a little bit more or that drag a little bit down. They usually aren't the same states year over year. It might have to do with budgeting practice changes or something along those lines. There are districts, individual districts, that will have a spike more so than just state. MDR does offer a spending trends indicator. One of those selections is to be able to identify districts that have had year over year growth, as well as those that have had an over 10% growth since the prior year. So that's a great way to identify districts that are in a growth pattern for education. You can talk to your MDR rep who can help you with counts on those to be able to target those districts if you're interested in knowing which seem to have the upward trend in spending.
Thank you. And along the lines of, data changes and trends, a lot of people are talking about, the changes this school year that we're seeing so far in the back and forth because of COVID. Can you talk a little bit about data shifts in education? Is that typical, atypical? And can you talk a little bit about, what MDR sees in terms of shift in data?
Sure. Honestly, I think it's a little too soon to tell what kind of shifts they're going to be. It'll be interesting this year as we compile our K-12 teacher and support personnel database to see. We track year over year the amount of churn that happens, how many teachers are coming, how many teachers are leaving. We do that by getting school by school the active teachers, and we've been working on that since the beginning of September. We don't have, and we've reviewed about 60% of the teachers. We need a little bit more before we can kind of say it's a real trend for the year. But I would anticipate that we will see some shifts along those lines. It's difficult. We've tried to collect information on remote versus in-school versus hybrid, but I think and we have gotten answers as to what in many districts, what their primary source is using. But as I'm sure everybody sees in their own local news, individual schools or districts will go on a 2-week shutdown depending upon what the infection rate is or exposure is, and then reopen again. But most school systems are offering some kind of remote option to students. And there are not a lot of school districts that are still mandating for long range, only remote as their option. There are still some districts doing that. But the data shifts so frequently, it's hard to keep up and know which way the trend is right now. And spending trends, it'll be difficult to see until, again, we kind of get into the year and the districts know if they're going to get additional supplemental funding and such. So I guess we'll wait and see for that too. But we are trying to keep a hand on the pulse, and we will continue to try to provide directionals wherever we feel they can be helpful in targeting.
Thank you, Ann. That was great. A couple of things I'd like to add to that is as far as the expenditure, I always say the expenditure goes up every year. I have rarely been to a Board of Education meeting or heard of one where the school comes and requests a smaller budget. My local taxes always go up, and they are linked to the school budget very closely. So I think that tend to see that. So thank you, Ann, for your incredible insight and continuing to support all of our customers' questions that we would have no way of answering without you. So we greatly appreciate that. That was full of information. We're very grateful. We do have a break scheduled now. We will be back at, we're going to go to a little break, give everybody a little break to get to your emails or take a look at things. But the next session is coming up. It is a great session. I've seen it. And it is Education Marketing 101 with Deneen Serrata, and it will begin at 1:45. So we look forward to seeing you then.